Welcome to all of you. Good evening from the Philippines, where I am based. But of course, good morning to all our colleagues in the Latin American Caribbean region. Good afternoon to our colleagues from the Arab and also from Europe, as well as in Africa. So today we're going to have this webinar. Our webinar has a long title, One Last Push to Finance SDG4, Inclusive, Equitable, and Quality Education and Lifelong Learning for All. Education as a critical enabler for peace, social justice, and all other SDGs. Colleagues, the 2026 ECOSOC Financing for Development Forum is now taking place from April 20 to 24 at the UN headquarters, bringing together all UN member states, hopefully all UN member states, and stakeholders following up on the momentum and commitments of the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development held in Seville, Spain in June 2025. If you remember, GCE had a very strong presence at FfD4, and I can see a few colleagues here who were there. And we worked together alongside the wider civil society movements to call for reforms to the global financial architecture. This included advocating for fairer global tax rules and more just, effective debt mechanism. Today, we continue our advocacy by engaging the ECOSOC Financing for Development Forum 2026 through this virtual webinar, through this virtual side event. This webinar calls on member states and world leaders to reform the global financial architecture, invest boldly in education, and propose concrete solutions to address the financing gap in education. GCE and partners convened this event as part of the Global Action Week for Education 2026 with the theme Education Financing, calling all governments and the international community to hold the flame high for education. As I mentioned, the ECOSOC Forum has already started. And in his opening speech in the ECOSOC Forum, Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that governments are spending more on instruments of death than the foundations of development and peace. This is such a very political statement coming from the Secretary General. He further argued that the financing for development is not only about economic progress. It is first and foremost about human progress, which includes being able to afford to eat, young people going to school. Education is the foundation of development and peace, and this is the belief of GCE, of all of us. Governments need to make a political decision to finance education. And to discuss this more in depth, I call Refat Saba, the president of the Global Campaign for Education, to talk about financing education as a political decision. So over to you, Refat.
Thank you, Thea. So do I have 5 minutes or more?
Let's see.
Okay, I will start with the short one.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Thea, and thank you, the Secretary of GCE, for organizing all this event, and special thanks for our friend Grant, who is leading all this activity during the Global Action Week. The Global Action Week is really one of the core events that GCE demand each year to raise a hot subject, which is now we are speaking about financing education. It's one of the most hot always subject that we are handled in GCE. Education, as my colleague Thea mentioned, education financing is a political decision. Education financing is not merely a technical or financial matter. At its core, it is a political decision that reflects a state priorities and values. When governments choose how to allocate their resources, they are in fact deciding who is worthy of investment. Is it people or instruments of control? Is it the future or the management of the crisis? In our context, this becomes particularly evident. A decline in education financing does not simply mean fewer schools or teachers. It leads to the reproduction of poverty, the widening of social inequalities, and the weakening of social resilience. Education is not a service sector that can be reduced in times of crisis. It is the first line of defense of dignity, identity, and justice. The claim that resources are limited often serves as a political justification. The real question is not whether we have the money, but where we choose to allocate the money. Here lies the responsibility of governments to adopt fair tax policies, strengthen domestic resource mobilization, and resist turning education into a commodity governed by market logic. Therefore, education financing must be understood as a political and ethical commitment, not as an optional or deferable choice. It requires a genuine partnership between governments, civil society, and international actors, grounded in accountability and transparency, and in the recognition of the education as a fundamental right that is not open to compromise. Ultimately, investing in education is an investment in freedom and in the kind of the future we seek for our children, a future that is more just, more human, and better equipped to face challenges. I hope you will be succeed in your webinar, and we can together raise the issue of all the education agenda matters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Refat, and for reminding us that education is the first line of dignity and that financing education is not optional, but it is an obligation of the states to guarantee the right to education. I hope, colleagues, you can hear me. Okay. So now we go to the next discussion point, and this is about the education and financing work of GCE. Since the Global Campaign for Education has been established in 1999, education financing has been a core advocacy of the movement. Our work spans from changing the financial architecture to ensuring budget allocation to education and also transparency in using the funds in education. To discuss more about the imperative of education financing, the work of GCE from systemic issues to budgets, let me invite Grant Kasuanjete, the Global Coordinator of GCE. Over to you, Grant.
Thank you so much, Thea. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, Grant. Yes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues and friends. I want to start with a striking fact. Over 260 million children worldwide are out of school, many because of inequitable financing. It's a stark reminder that how we fund education is a matter of life and death for opportunity. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation today as we are reflecting on one of the most pressing challenges of our time, how we finance education. Because let's be clear, education financing, just as Rifat mentioned, is not just about balancing budgets. It is about shaping the future of our societies, deciding whether opportunity will equally be shared or unevenly withheld. First, let's deal with systemic issues. We know that financing must confront inequality head-on. Too often, rural schools, marginalized communities, and learners with disabilities receive less support. If we fail to correct this, education becomes a mechanism for reproducing inequalities rather than reducing them. Secondly, quality matters as much as access. It is not enough to open the school doors. We must ensure that what happens inside those classrooms prepare young people for the world they will inherit. That means investing in teacher training, in curriculum innovation, and in digital infrastructure. Without these, we risk producing learners who are unprepared for modern economies. And thirdly, sustainability. Financing models must withstand economic shocks. Over-reliance on donor funding or short-term projects leaves systems fragile. Governments need resilient domestic financing that ensures education is not the first casualty of a crisis, as we saw during the COVID-19 period. Now, let's go to budget realities. The practical side of the equation, as I call it. Education budgets compete with other social service budgets. I think this is common knowledge to all of us. But policymakers must recognize education as a multiplier. Every dollar invested in education reduces future costs in unemployment, crime, and poor health. Efficiency is equally critical. It's not only about how much we spend, but how wisely. Transparent allocation, monitoring, and accountability ensures that funds reach classrooms and not just bureaucratic layers. And finally, innovation. Beyond traditional budgets, we have to explore innovative ways that do not exacerbate inequalities, but encourage efficiency and accountability. So, what is the imperative? It is to design financing models that are equitable, sustainable, and efficient. If we fail, we risk leaving generations behind. But if we succeed, we unlock the full potential of education as the cornerstone of social and economic progress. To move from the principle to practice, we must recognize that financing is not just about the size of the budget. It is about the structure and priorities that determine whether resources reach those who need them most. Bridging systemic issues with budgetary choices require intentional design, where equity, sustainability, and efficiency are embedded into every decision. The imperative of education financing is therefore clear. Without systemic reforms and thoughtful budgeting, we risk entrenching inequalities and limiting future growth. But with strategic investment, education can be the engine that drives inclusive and sustainable development. The challenge is not whether we can afford to finance education, it's whether we can afford not to. Because in the end, the true cost of inaction is measured not in currency, but in wasted human potential. And as GCE, these are the things that, we are working towards with all the members, to ensure that, the budgets that are being set takes into account all the issues that, I've listed, and that, governments are taking all these matters very, very seriously. Thank you so much, there.
Thank you so much, Grant. And I have two takeaways from your sharing. One is that education financing must be fixed to address the systemic barriers to education and the widening inequalities. And very importantly, financing of public education system must be rights-based. So thank you for those and for sharing the GCE's work on systemic issues to budgets. Okay, so colleagues, if you remember, the Transforming Education Summit was convened during the UN General Assembly in 2022. And this summit, or as we call it, TESS, brought together governments, civil society, youth, international organizations to address, at that time, the global learning crisis and up to now. And also, there were a lot of discussions about reimagining education systems for the future. The summit emphasized the need for increased and more effective financing, inclusive policies, and stronger accountabilities. But 4 years since that Transforming Education Summit, what has been the progress? And with us now, we are very fortunate to have Vernor Munoz. I'm sure you are very familiar with Vernor. He's been the head of policy and advocacy of GCE, and he has gladly helped us to do the report on monitoring the Transforming Education Summit, particularly education financing track. And he will present to us the highlights of that report. So over to you, Vernor.
Thank you very much, Thea, and good morning from Costa Rica, everyone. I would like to begin by thanking the Global Campaign for Education for the invitation to participate in this important side event. So my contribution today is part of the broader monitoring work that the GCE is carrying out on the commitments made at the Transforming Education Summit, as Thea pointed out. Work that is essential to hold governments and institutions accountable for the promises they have made. So as we all know, that TES was meant to be a turning point, a moment when world leaders would finally take seriously their obligation to fund education. Instead, it has become, from my point of view, another example of promises made and broken. In many cases, we have gone backwards. The numbers tell the story plainly. Children in low-income countries receive just $5 per year in education spending compared to the over $8,000 in wealthy OECD nations. And UNICEF projects that education funding will fall by $3.2 billion by 2026 this year, a 24% cut from 2023 levels. If that happens, the number of children out of school will rise from 272 million to 278 million. And these are not abstract statistics. They represent real people denied the right to education. The education funding crisis is not an accident. It is the result of deliberate political and economic choices that continue to deprive governments, especially those in the global south, of the resources they need to build strong public education systems. And let us be direct. Colonialism did not end. The same extractive logics that once justified the plunder of land and labor now operate through debt, conditionalities, and financial dependence. The countries that were colonized are today the ones being told they cannot afford to educate their children, while continuing to service debts imposed by the very institutions that claim to support their development. International financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF have repeatedly imposed austerity measures and debt-based conditionalities that force countries to cut social spending. And these are colonial practices embedded in financial architecture, and they must be named and dismantled. Meanwhile, widespread tax evasion, and corporate tax avoidance drain public revenues that could otherwise fund schools, teachers, and students. Corporations that profit in developing economies while avoiding taxes in those same jurisdictions bear direct responsibility for the funding gaps we are documenting today. The geopolitical environment is making things worse. The tariffs imposed by the United States in 2025 have slowed economic growth across regions, reducing tax revenues and squeezing education budgets. Lower growth means less money for schools. Is that direct? At the same time, military spending is surging. NATO EU countries increased their military budgets by nearly 50% between 2014 and 2023, while education capital investment grew only 24%. The EU's Rearm Europe plan, announced in March 2025, proposes 800 billion euros for defense, more than was mobilized during the entire COVID-19 pandemic response. Now, research tells us that a 1% increase in military spending can reduce a country's economic growth by 9% over time. So every euro spent on arms is a euro not spent on children's future. And this trade-off is a political choice, and it is the wrong one. We are witnessing a troubling transformation within multilateral institutions. Corporations and their foundations have gained increasing influence over international education agendas in spaces that were historically reserved for states and civil society. The result is a governance architecture that increasingly prioritizes economic efficiency over human rights, reducing education to workforce training for precarious labor markets. Paradoxically, as corporations gain more access to governance spaces, civil society organizations representing affected communities are being pushed out. This was very visible at the Fourth International Conference on Financing for Development in Sevilla, and it is happening with increasing regularity at the UN High-Level Political Forum. So states and international institutions must take concrete action. So we demand as civil society, first, to end the extractive financing, replace debt-driven models with grants and debt cancellation so countries can invest in quality public education without external constraint. Second, restore civil society participation. Education governance must center the voices of the community it serves, not corporate proxies. Third, support the Southern-led solutions. International cooperation must support, not dictate, education policy. Local knowledge and community priorities must be respected, not overridden, but the Northern agendas. And finally, hold the powerful accountable. Northern governments, international financial institutions, and corporations must face real accountability for policies that perpetuate inequality in global education. The world does not lack the resources to fund quality public education. It lacks the political will. The same actors who gather at summits to celebrate commitments to SDG 4 are the ones whose decisions on debt, tariffs, military spending, or corporate governance make those commitments impossible to fulfill. Genuine transformation means confronting the structural injustices, colonial, corporate, and geopolitical, that sustain this crisis. It means choosing schools over arms, rights over austerity, and communities over corporations. So we call on all states, institutions, and actors to move beyond declarations and take the bold structural action that the right to education demands. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vernor. And again, we hear the same message that education financing and its crisis is not an accident, but it's a political decision. And Vernor pointed out very importantly that those who hold power and those who are meeting in the UN are those who control the decision making on use of loans, investments, and also the financial infrastructure. And we have the responsibility to challenge this. It's interesting also that if you listen to the opening remarks of the Secretary General, he was also talking about these issues of systemic barriers to education and to the SDGs and financing. So now we go to the realities. What are the realities in the regions? And we invited several regions to share with us the education financing situation. But first, we start with education financing in Asia Pacific. And Rene Raya will talk about the declining spending and privatization of education in Asia Pacific. And together with him, we have Shanta Kulatunge. He is the National Coordinator, Coalition for Educational Development Sri Lanka. And Rene Raya, by the way, is the Regional Policy Advocacy Coordinator and Lead Policy Analyst of Asia South Pacific Association for Basic and Adult Education. So let us start with Rene, and I'm going to share your PowerPoint. One moment.
Yes, thank you, Thea. And Bernard, very true. In the context also of Asia and the Pacific, so many of the points that you mentioned are actually existing in the context of our region. So let me just give a snapshot, Thea, if my PowerPoint is already there.
Okay. Okay, one moment.
Okay, so this is just a quick overview of the Asia Pacific region context on education financing. And, there's a lot of disparity in this region. For one, Asia Pacific has been the most dynamic economic region globally for several decades now. But no, extreme poverty and inequality persist, and even in some contexts has been increasing. The region is still home to half of the world's poorest people. It has the largest concentration of youth and adult illiterates. Gender disparities in education persist in most countries in the region, and still huge number of out-of-school children and youth are all around in the different sub-regions of Asia Pacific. And yeah, Asia Pacific, even if it's supposed to be a dynamic economic region, is actually the least spender in education in relation to the size of the economy. So specifically, South Asia and even Southeast Asia are among or are the least spender in education. Asia Pacific also is the most privatized education system globally. And this is true very much for South Asia, but also including Oceania and Southeast Asia, and even former socialist countries such as in Central Asia and East Asia are also increasing the privatization of education system in those countries. And yeah, in the next slide, we can see that over the years, there has been a rapid race to the bottom in terms of corporate income tax. And Asia actually is leading in this race among all other global regions and in comparison to the world average. And so from 40%, it has gone down to less than 20%. And in terms of tax revenue, as you can see, it is also one of the lowest at 8.2% of the GDP, much lower than the global average and much lower than many other regions in the world. And finally, as also Bernard mentioned, no, billions and trillions of dollars are lost annually in illicit funding flow, and Asia-Pacific region accounted for the largest share of global illicit financial flows. As you can see in this red, font, where we see that developing Asia Pacific, so it doesn't include the high-income countries, so only the developing countries in the region, has a very high level of illicit funding flows as well as loss in tax revenues. And so with this, I hand over for a specific country situation. Shanta, over to you.
Thank you, Rene, and thank you, Thea. I'm Shanta from Sri Lanka, and good evening from Sri Lanka to all of you. Thea, if you can share the presentation. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay, I will start my presentation today with, I will briefly explain you about the current economic crisis situation and then the leading factors contributed to this situation. And then I will explain the measures taken by the government to address these issues. And finally, I will share the impact of the situation on the education sector in Sri Lanka. So that is the order of my presentation. Actually, Sri Lanka has a very good education system. It's a totally free education system that was introduced in 1947. So under this system, every child gets the opportunity for complete their education from primary to secondary and the university level free of charge. So, and Sri Lanka has already we have a well-established administration system to govern and manage the public education. And that free education system has played a significant role to social mobility and the social transformation in Sri Lanka. So that is basically to introduce about the Sri Lankan education system. So we will next move to the economic crisis Sri Lanka that is facing right now. Next slide. There.
Can you see it, Shanta? It's on slide.
So in from 2019 onward, I mean just when we started the COVID situation, actually from 2019 to 2024, Sri Lanka experienced a significant economic crisis. This is basically because of the lack of government revenue and rising public debt. And actually, in this situation, the government has to substantially reduce the funding for the essential social services, including the education. So we will see in the next slide. So what are the factors for this kind of economic crisis? The first one is the economic mishandling, because the previous regimes actually they made some popular decision to take the advantage of the political gaining. So they have mishandled the total funding, I mean the public funding, and they have given tax reduction for the private sector and the big companies. So government has, because the ultimate result of that government revenue has been decreased. And because of this situation, Sri Lanka has to default its loan payment in 2022, and we are in debt now, and we don't have the adequate foreign resource to import our essential items, and our currency has depreciated. And the final point is very important, because Sri Lanka is one of the countries that the lowest tax to GDP ratio. That ratio is 7.3% for the GDP. Next slide. Yeah. So given in this situation, the government, actually the previous government takes some measures to address these challenges. So actually their main source of income, I mean, to get the funding from the IMF. So in 2023, actually IMF approved to a 2.9 billion US dollar loan to resolve the economic crisis in Sri Lanka. And they also propose some debt structuring. So some of the process now we have been completed, but some is still to be completed. And they also suggest some economic the tax reforms. Actually they suggest to increase the direct tax and indirect tax as well. In addition to that, we are planned to increase the tax to GDP ratio up to 14%. Now that is our expectation. And in addition to that, the government also introduced some policies and acts to stable the economy in Sri Lanka. So we will move to the next slides. Then I would like to draw your attention to the government education expenditure. You can see that Sri Lanka can be considered as one of the country that allocate least percentage of GDP for the education. In the 2026 budget, the government has allocated 704 billion rupees for the education, accounting for the approximately 2% of the GDP. But actually, as a civil society organization, we are demanding make it for 6% of the GDP to allocate for the education, but that is not the reality. So we will move to the next slide there, because we can show you some interesting points. So according to the IMF conditions, Sri Lanka has introduced a Public Finance Management Act number 44 in 2024. According to that, the government primary expenditure should not exceed the 13% of the estimated nominal gross domestic product for the relevant fiscal year. So that is the reality. So actually this is to make sure that debt obligation and to keep the funds for the interest payment. So the ultimate result is that staying with that 13% of the GDP limit in the next few years means that we are unable to allocate more than 2% of the GDP for the education for the next year. So that is the reality. And although the government has promised to remove the VAT, I mean, now they have imposed 18% VAT on everything. And actually the current government, they promised to remove the VAT for the education materials and services, but that was not the reality. Now we are experiencing that the reality. So they have imposed the tax on the education material as well. So this is the real situation. So within this context, so I will like to present our recommendation for the government to promote the education in Sri Lanka. Next slide, please. So actually, these recommendations are based on derived from the fact that recently we have conducted a study on the education finance in Sri Lanka. In addition to that, I have drawn some fact from the Human Rights Watch study as well. So with that base, we would like to recommend that we need to reform the tax system to support the education equity. Actually, we need to expand the progressive direct taxation rather than putting imposing indirect taxes. So we propose to reduce reliance on the indirect taxes like VAT, particularly VAT, that 18% on the goods right now. And we actually, in addition to that, we need to review the tax, rationalize. We need to review and rationalize the tax expansions, because actually this kind of crisis, it is not just a thing that happened in 2019. That is gradually coming from the 2010 onwards. So this kind of tax exemption for the the companies or the other sectors, private sectors, the ultimate results that we were unable to collect the tax regularly, and we were unable to increase the government public income. So that is happened. This is big. This is the main factors to this kind of economic crisis in Sri Lanka. So we need to advocate to review and rationalize the tax exemptions and concessions that given to the other sectors, and it will lead to ensure the funding for the education sector in Sri Lanka. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shanta. And we can see really the realities at the country level. We have been talking about austerity measures, imposition of the IMF, and Sri Lanka, as shared by Shanta. There is the reality, there is a cut in budget spending to pay for debt payments and interest payments. So thank you very much for that, Shanta, for sharing the unfortunate reality in your country. But we do hope your recommendations will be taken on, and there will be a strong advocacy in your country. Colleagues, I forgot to ask you to give a digital clap to our speakers. So at this point, let us all give a big round of applause to Refat, to Grant, Vernor, Rene, and Shanta. Let's give them a big round of applause. Thank you so much for your presentations. And I realize they are all men, so sorry about that. Okay. So now from Asia Pacific, we now go to the Arab and Middle East region. And with us, we have Kamal Messawi. He is the coordinator of the Tunisian National Education Coalition, which is a member of the Arab Campaign for Education for All. And so over to you, Kamal, to discuss education financing in your region.
شكرا للحملة العالمية للتعليم على إتاحة
Thank you so much for the global campaign for education to speak about this important thing regarding education. Thank you so much for the Arab campaign regarding the education, regarding the situation of education in the Arab world. It is a very important issue which financing education, which is one of the most important issues that to be raised, because financing education is the main guarantees, and the main guarantees, this is the right that to be gained by all people, from education in the school and education in institutions, and so that we can afford the environment suitable for all the students. But we have to characterize such obstacles. We witness a great backward in education, and this can confirm the development so that we can achieve the fourth global education requirements and the rights, the right of those who are going to be educated. There is great backward in the term of education, especially in the area of public education and private education, because there is no any public expenditure or there is no any financing mechanism for education in such cases, and we have to in such cases the education is witnessing privatization, and that education can be a commodity to be bought or sold in any commercial places, and this is what differs or makes us different from other countries, and these figures can confirm these trends. And the most important issue is that there is no any financing in the term of education, and the effect of war and crisis also has affected this situation in a great term. There is deficiency to pay teachers salaries, and even we missed millions of people, millions of students to have their rights in education, and there are many examples in Gaza, in Lebanon, Sudan, and many other Arab countries, which the situation is common in the Arab world. So we have to do our best so that we can pay or we can finance education. And we know that war and crisis affect the issue of education greatly, and we have to be careful that what we're witnessing now is a great crisis with all its meaning, and we have to stand for that and to face that.
Yes.
But the characterization or the diagnosis of such situation, we have to make recommendations such as we have to reactivate the role of civil society organizations so that we can review the financing and to allocate not less than 20% of education process. Two, we have to search for another resources for education financing, such as exceptional tax to be imposed on financial institutions, so that the civil society organization has its own role that can be played. That we have allocate. Sorry, the sound is not. Sorry. There is another entrance so that we can have the social equality, which is a very important issue in the issue of expenditure in education. We have to we have done many things in the parliament, and we have discussed these things and the way of increasing the financing the educational system, and this can be a positive side, so that they can have a law in 2025 to have a fund for financing the education and to find other ways for financing this sector. This will increase the improvement of the education and will achieve the development in the Arab world. Also, we have to put some proposals so that we can make this education our priorities, and also we have to call on all Arab world that they can increase expenditure in the education. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Kamal, for sharing the situation in education financing, not only education financing in the Arab region, but also the realities of war and how it has shrink the fiscal space in these countries, the very fragile situation in the region, and where private sector now comes in like vultures, exploiting the situation. So thank you so much, and thank you for your continued advocacy in the Arab region despite the difficulties. Thank you to ACA and Tunisia National Education Coalition. So colleagues, now we go to a discussion of the impact of that on education in Africa. And we know that today, 54 countries, home to 3.4 billion people, spend more on debt servicing than on health or education. And this is really the scale of the global crisis. If we look at the financial crisis today, number one is on debt, the debt distress of countries, developing countries. To talk about how that is impacting on education in Africa, we have invited Tahiro Traore. He is the national coordinator of the coalition in Burkina Faso, and he is also speaking on behalf of the African Network Campaign for Education for All. So over to you, Tahiro. Tahiro.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Bonjour.
Toujours stable. Je vais enlever la vidéo. Donc pour pouvoir,
good morning. I'm going to switch on my video so that I'm able to communicate with you.
Alors, disons que
So, I would like to say, so we like to extend our congratulations for people who organized this meeting, because it's an issue for us to see the population who are not schooled in the world. So it's very humiliating. So it's almost half of this population is in Africa. That's the reason why we are saying that this is a good opportunity for us is also to present and then to speak about the progress that we are making, and also on the issue of funding. So I would like to say, before I could start, I would like to remind of the commitments that were made at the World Forum of Education that was organized in 2015. The head of state and government and also the international community have adopted a program for 2030 education, which is defining the vision of education for the 15 years to come. So that vision that's looking to transform everything is also universal. So they were supposed to deal on issues of development related to education by dealing with challenges in the world. So the education agenda, 2030 education agenda, found its expression in the world development objective, which is so that everybody could have access to education, and then a quality education, and then to be able to learn. So we are seeing that the issue of a quality education is put at the heart of our education system. So if with regard to the World Summit, our countries took some commitment, made some commitment. So to improve the funding for education, the African Union equally also said the year 2024 was the year of education. The continental strategy of 2016 recognized that the education system is losing its it has to be promoted, because otherwise the sustainable development goals are not going to be met, especially at the national level. So what can we observe now? It's true that there were some problems and then some promises that were encouraging in the sector of education. Also the parity of gender in several African countries. So it's a reality. So although the most important disparity are still there, which has been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, the main factors of disparity is mostly the handicap. So it's the level of education for parents, and then the geographical location. So what is major for us to deal with challenges? We need to mobilize resources and then more finances at the level of African countries, so that we could transform our education system. First of all, it's the tax, and then also we need to go through austerity. With regard to tax, since as the declaration is providing, government need to increase their GDP at least to 3 to 4% to put into education. They also need to make sure that fiscal justice and adopt some progressive tax reforms so that they can increase national revenues. So, according to the African Union numbers, African countries are losing almost $8 billion for fiscal revenue due to the tax evasion that is practiced by foreign companies. So these numbers are in any way underestimated. So it's more than 78% of countries in Africa, they've got a very lower fiscal rate. 65% of countries so their fiscal revenue is very, very low. So the proportion of fiscal of low-income revenue countries is compared to is about 3%. If the countries of African Union increase their proportion as per the IMF recommendations, so they will have 146 billion on top of what they already have. If 20% of those 146 billion should be put on education, that will allow to mobilize $29 billion for education each year, which will transform the education sector and then also generate revenues. Even the fight for the climate change. So that will help to cover 25 billion. On 52 countries of the African Union, the International Monetary Fund, most countries are over indebted. So on the 52 on the African Union, 52% are already in the process. So 20% are exposed to a risk of debt that they are contracting. 28 of 52 countries of the African Union are most of their budget is for them to pay the debt. So les
dépenses deviennent drastiques. Donc 15 pays de l'Union africaine consacrent déjà davantage de dépenses au service de la dette jusqu'à l'éducation. Alors, sur le plan de l'austérité, disons que 79% des pays de l'Union africaine prévoient de réduire le total des dépenses publiques en pourcentage du PIB.
As regards austerity, 72% dedicate less than the world average, 9% of the GDP to the public sector, 20% in reduction of public debt, and 28% of African countries. Regarding the political orientations, 96% were recommended to reduce or to freeze the expenditures for public servants. To conclude, we are going to say that investing in education constitutes the best strategy for individuals or society in order to deal with the economic growth, to strengthen or to ensure a sustainable future. The time has come to invest in education in order to profit from the potential. These stakes are very important, and yet Africa is having a deficit of expenditure in the domain of education, 80%, which means 28 of 35 countries for which the revenues are available did not reach the threshold consisting of dedicating 20% of the budget to education. 10 countries are dedicating 10% of their budget to education. The total amount of budget is as important as the share for education. It is important to make sure that revenues will be mobilized and shared in a way to promote equity and fight against gender inequalities and other inequalities. In order to reduce the debt on African countries, I think it is important to have the mechanisms of negotiation about the debts and to allow countries to mobilize resources that are going to be important for education and to recruit teachers that the African countries will need, as well as the implementation of mechanism guaranteeing transparency and responsibility in education, which involve reducing financial embezzlement, particularly regarding the expenditures. That is what we can talk so far. Thank you so much for listening.
Merci, Tahiru. Thank you so much for your presentation. And colleagues, let's give Tahiru a digital clap. Thank you so much for sharing the realities of education financing in Africa. So from Africa, we now go to the Latin America and Caribbean region. And with us is Israel Quirino. He is a assistant program officer at the Latin American Campaign on the Right to Education, or CLADE, and he's going to talk about tax justice and education and referring to some country cases and their advocacy in Latin America and the Caribbean. So over to you, Israel.
Thank you, Thea. Thank you, colleagues. So allow me to start with a very relatable short story. When I was in primary school, we used to do many field trips. And every time we did a field trip, the school had to notify our parents. And the notes always ended with the same sentence: those who can, please bring a snack to share. My parents took that very seriously, so they packed my backpack with enough food for me to share. And by the end of the trip, we sit together and ate from the common snack table without considering if you brought a lot or if you did not bring anything. I didn't consider this at the time, but this small sentence on the end of the note allowed everyone to attend the field trips, even those who did not have enough money to bring a snack. I believe that everyone has a similar experience, especially in school. The truth is that these experiences are one of the most precious experiences we can have during our school years. It's not just about generosity, it is about developing a sense of justice, a perception that everyone is happier when those who have more provide a larger share of a common benefit than those who have less. It applies to snacks and it applies to tax. How does this relate with our discussion on tax justice? Well, we know that the richest people on the planet benefit from many loopholes to profit and maintain their multi-million-dollar net worth. Two of these loopholes are regressive taxation and tax avoidance. By regressive taxation, as we are all aware, we mean those systems where we overtax consumption and subtax income, meaning that those who receive less will pay proportionally more tax than those who receive more. A regressive system, as we have in many Latin American and Caribbean countries, creates bottlenecks for increasing the size of the general budget that can be used for public services, since taxing more would impact the consumption of poorer families. A progressive system, on the other hand, would mean the opposite. Those who have more will pay more, and those who have less will pay less based on their income. Let's see how that could work in Latin America and the Caribbean. So in this region, taxing those who have over $1 million in patrimony with a progressive tax income between 2% and 3.5%, would mean the collection of approximately $26 billion annually. If we consider the OECD estimates that a person on school age costs on average $13,000 annually, progressive taxation could finance 2 million students in Latin America and the Caribbean each year. It is a small share for the super rich, but a big difference for public education. But a progressive tax system is just a beautiful term if we do not stop tax avoidance. Let's take Honduras as an example. In Honduras, in 2023, the resources allocated to public education were equivalent to 3% of the GDP. As we all know, this is below the international threshold of allocating 4 to 6% of GDP for education. Many could say that there is no money to reach the 6%. But in Honduras, during the same year, the amount lost due to tax evasion and tax elusion was equivalent to 16% of Honduras' GDP. So, if we eliminated tax evasion and tax elusion in Honduras, we could finance public education for almost 3 full years, considering the international threshold of 6% of GDP. However, it is important to have in mind that if we consider only the international thresholds of 6% of GDP and 20% of domestic expenditure, we can fall into a trap, a false sense of fulfillment. If a country like Honduras allocated 20% of its national budget for education, it wouldn't be enough because its national budget is too small. So, although it is relevant to defend these international thresholds since they are not being fulfilled, as René already mentioned, it is important to have in mind that quality public education can cost more than that. This is why the cost of quality education per student, a methodology applied in Brazil, is so relevant. By using this methodology, developed by civil society and academia, education financing is not measured as part of something bigger, either the GDP or national budget. It's measured by the needs of students to achieve a minimum standard of quality public education. This considers not just learning needs, such as libraries and materials, and teaching needs, such as adequate salary and training, but also the different needs of different modalities, such as pre-primary education, primary, secondary, and adult learning. And also the reality of each context, the reality of growth, the reality of rural areas, the reality of urban poorer areas, and all that. This addition to our framework is relevant for us to advocate for tax justice and education financing with clarity, grounding our demands on data and sustainable solutions. This is why we need to hold the flame high for education financing and for tax justice, because it can lead to a powerful impact on public education. I'd like to end this intervention with just 3 quick recommendations for our advocacy processes on this matter. First recommendation, national tax systems must be progressive, so states can have the amount necessary to tackle inequalities and provide for public services. The second recommendation is to eliminate tax avoidance. Regional and global frameworks are just as important as national policies. The money of the super rich knows no boundaries, so our advocacy should also be transnational. And finally, how the money is spent is just as relevant as how it is raised. So we must call for accountability and effectiveness on education budgets, so our efforts for tax justice do not go to waste. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Israel. And your presentation and recommendations are really a very good way of going into the next session. So thank you so much. And let's give Israel a digital clap. Thank you, Israel. And while you were talking about equity in tax, equity in expenditure, I also remembered an article I read that the rich people don't really pay taxes on fuel that they use for their private jets, which is really scandalous. But yeah, we have to know more about this while we pay our fuel tax every day. So before we go into the next session, where we will talk about what we can do in terms of reforming or challenging the global tax abuse, I would like to ask Lebo to share the poll, and this is a feedback form. Lebo, are you there? And thank you, Enam, for your comment. We will have a poll to get feedback from you about this webinar. Okay, while we are waiting for that, I'll go ahead and proceed with our next session. As I mentioned, there is a solution, and we are engaging in the transnational advocacy, as mentioned by Israel. We need to come together. We need to be solidified in terms of our effort in changing the global financial architecture. And there's a first step. Currently, there is intergovernmental negotiations on the UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. And we, as civil society coming from developing countries, must put pressure on this, because as we know, those who are powerful, those who are coming from developed countries are the ones who are resisting this change. But let me ask Uchizi Ngulube from TaxEd Alliance to talk more about this, changing the global tax rules, and what are the implications for the education sector. So over to you, Uchizi. Uchizi, are you there? Okay, Uchizi.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cecilia. Apologies, again, it's your gender balance isn't quite right for this meeting, but I am representing Ashina, who many of you know, under the Tax and Education Alliance. So I'll just quickly share a few insights on some of the actions we've been making as a Tax and Education Alliance. Let me just quickly share my presentation. Okay, thank you once again, Cecilia and team. Yeah, so as I've been introduced, my name is Uchizi. I am working with the Tax and Education Alliance in Zambia, and I think I'll just walk us through some of the global actions that are relevant for the education space, education advocacy, and particularly for this week, the Global Action Week for Education, and then also some of the interventions we've made at national level, but also at regional levels, to champion education financing as a whole. So I think, as has already been mentioned, I think by previous speakers, 2022, there was a Transforming Education Summit where there was commitments around gender equality in education, financing education, but also addressing the wider education crisis. And I think since then, there's also been the Financing for Development process, which yielded the severe commitment and symbolized a renewed commitment towards the SDG agenda, but also towards financing these sustainable development goals. And this was around investment, around debt, but also around reforming the international financial architecture. So I think this is also very relevant, especially when you look at going forward as advocates for education financing, but also as advocates for the wider development of our nations, but also of the globe. So from there, we've seen various reports coming out, but particularly looking at the Financing Sustainable Development Report, we can see that there are various actions that came out of the discussions in Sevilla last year. And some of these are looking at strengthening tax systems, increasing DRM capacity, but also reforming the global financial architecture. So I think a key moment and a key process that we've been following not only as the Tax and Education Alliance, but I know also colleagues from the Global Campaign for Education and others have been advocating for this UN Tax Convention, which is basically an opportunity for us to correct historical injustices that have deprived Global South countries for decades. And that includes Zambia, who are part of the global or the Africa group, who have been instrumental when it comes to these discussions at the UN Tax Convention. And we have been interacting with some of the negotiators and the key actors from our revenue authorities and ministries of finance to see how we can ensure that public services, particularly education, are reflective in this UN Tax Convention. And it's something we continue to look at this year. But just a bit of background, looking a bit closer at Zambia and why tax is important, but also why the debt crisis, which has been highlighted in from previous speakers, is a big problem for us. So as you can see, looking at the education spending, we've only met the 20% threshold of our national budget once in 2015. And since then, we've seen a reduced spending on education in Zambia. But at the same time, we've seen debt servicing increase quite significantly. Some of you may know that Zambia defaulted in 2020. And since then, those debt servicing costs reduced quite significantly as we try to renegotiate and restructure our debt. But as you can see, in the last 2 to 3 years, the trend is reversing again. We can see the reduction in education spending and other social sectors as well, while debt servicing is creeping up again. Another issue is on the tax side. And I like that Rene touched on some of the profit shifting issues that we have as a globe, but also this is just to highlight some of the losses that we experience as countries. So looking closer at Zambia, a study done by UNECA highlighted or estimated that Zambia is spending or losing, if I may say, about 15% of our GDP to tax expenditure. So this is your tax incentives given to multinationals, tax breaks and tax holidays that are foregone that could be redirected to key sectors such as education. And this 15% of GDP was estimated to be about 4 times what we were spending on education. So you can see that there's a big leakage when it comes to how much revenue we could be collecting and why it's important for us to be advocating for tax reform. A lot of these policies are also imposed on countries by international financial institutions such as the IMF, who champion for multinationals, who champion for private sector led growth, and also private sector to deliver various public services such as education. And the case of Zambia is not different from those that are also struggling with education financing and also tax collection for that matter. So I think some of the actions we've been taking as the Tax Aid Alliance, but also as advocates in Zambia, was to be using the 4S framework, looking at the size, the share, and the sensitivity of education budgets. And this has been used for capacity building, but also for our national budget submissions. Generating of new evidence has also been very helpful for us. So, for instance, assessing the financing gap towards education, looking at the austerity measures that are imposed and how they affect various policies and public services, while at the same time also interacting with ministries of finance, the IMF here in Zambia, and other international financial institutions to resist austerity measures which look like budget cuts, increased regressive taxation, and so on. So going forward, obviously, we continue to try to advocate for debt cancellation based on human rights. Also, there's need for us to also hold governments accountable to their commitments. I mentioned the Transforming Education Summit, but also commitments to reform the global financial architecture and other key policies such as the FfD outcome actions. And then also tracking global reforms, as I mentioned, but should be done at national, regional, and also global levels. And then also advocating for progressive domestic resource mobilization. As Israel mentioned, it's important for these measures to be progressive, because I think oftentimes we find that the advice we're getting for countries is to implement more regressive taxes, such as value-added tax, which can be harmful for gender, or which can entrench poverty and other inequalities, such as gender inequality. Lastly, also resisting the advice from international financial institutions. Like I mentioned, the private sector and PPPs has been used as a solution or been advised to governments to implement, as well as budget cuts, regressive taxation, and reduced labor rights, which we've seen within our teachers' unions, for instance, where they have less and less power based on advice given by the IMF. So I'll stop there. Cecilia, thank you for listening, and I've included some links, so I'll share the presentation with you after this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Uchizi, and a digital clap to Uchizi colleagues. Thank you for that presentation. And as you mentioned, we have to do this advocacy from the global to the regional, national, and also vice versa, from national, regional to global. And this is what we are doing in our movement. And in the third intergovernmental sessions in Nairobi, held in Nairobi last year, the National Education Coalition of Ghana was there to engage and connect with the delegate of Ghana, who is a co-facilitator in the intergovernmental sessions of the UN Tax Convention. And therefore, we have with us Bernice Empere Gieke. She is the national coordinator of the Ghana National Education Campaign Coalition. Hi, Bernice. And she will talk about the connections of the global to national and her reflections on the UN Tax Convention and the role of National Education Coalition. Before Bernice starts her presentation, I have to share her slides. One moment. Okay, one moment, Bernice.
All right, thank you, Cecilia, for this opportunity to also share. And I think finally, we have a female blending the speakers that have spoken so far. So we will have some balance. All right, so we were in Nairobi, and then we witnessing the UN Tax Convention proceedings. And then fortunately for me, Israel and Uchizi has really touched on a number of things. They've really given a detailed figures and statistics pertaining to tax and its related issues. So I would look at some few other ones, talking about how UN Tax Convention and education matters so much. Now, it gave us the opportunity to do a lot of global reflections and negotiations, because each country were present to at least make a voice or talk about how taxation processes and rights across the globe are being managed by the UN Tax Convention. And then we're also looking at linking tax justice to education financing, which is very key. We realized that social interventions were not so much mentioned during the UN Tax Conventions. It was a bit of a concern. We were really thinking that tax goes a long way to support social issues like education, health, water, sanitation, and then all that. But it didn't really come out strongly during the convention, and it was really a worry to us. And then we are happy that there were a lot of civil society national coalitions present. So we looked at the conventions, how it works, and the strategies that we can also use in terms of advocacy when we go back to our various countries, and also at the African and then the global alliances on tax justice that we have. So the context matters because still there is a financing gaps between developing countries and developed countries. It mostly sounds that anytime that there is negotiation, we feel that still developing countries do not have the upper hand to actually get what they have or the rights to tax justice across the globe. You realize that even goods that are produced in developed countries, the prices and the taxes are determined by rich countries or developed countries, as we call them, and it was really a challenge. And then also we realized that domestic resources mobilization was another critical thing because there are a lot of gaps in taxation and how taxes are taken. It has driven from the global level right to our very country specific context, because you realize that mostly still the poor are more taxed than the rich. In Ghana, we have this PAYE, pay as you earn, and then looking at what the rich earns and what the poor earns. If you strike the average, you realize that even the poor are paying more taxes compared to the rich. So reducing inequality in taxation would actually go a long way to support education and all the SDGs that we are just measuring by 2030, where we have few months to go. And then we barely have reached about 17% of the SDGs. Meanwhile, we have just some few years to catch up to the date that was given global. Now, promoting inclusive taxing, one of the issues that came out
pour
strongly
promouvoir donc
during the
la
UN
taxation,
tax
une des
convention
questions qui est arrivée
was
lors de la convention fiscale
inclusive taxation. Now, one of the issues that CSOs were raising was to have
une des problèmes qui a été évoquée,
a gender-based taxation rights where all the vulnerable people are being included when it comes to tax negotiations so that everyone can benefit equally. We're also looking at developing countries having a stronger voice, because most negotiations and then the UN Tax Convention, right, you could see that so developing countries do not have a stronger voice because, in quotes, it will seem as if they are not really rich or empowered enough to speak and have a strong voice when it comes to the negotiation. And then also when it comes to sustainable development financing, you could see that still there is more need to be done if it has to be linked with taxation. So now the key issues that we looked at during the negotiation is fair allocation of taxing rights. It is something that is still critical. And then we had a lot of backdoor engagement, backdoor advocacy with the top UN officials to see how we can have this fair taxation, allocation of taxes rights to every other person, every other country. It doesn't matter its level of development and then all that. And then also one of the key things is digital economy. It is very critical that now AI digitalization is going everywhere. So once it is linked globally and then the economy is linked to digitalization, it is also going to help. And then we also looked at illicit financial flows, which was very, very key. And then capacity gaps in tax administration was also one of the strong things that came out. There is a lot of gap when it comes to tax administration. Every country has its own processes and where it ends. Sometimes it ends at a position where you do not even have the right to talk about some processes that made some tax to be paid or allowed, and paying of duties on imported goods and then all that, because the administration, it is not straightforward from Africa to the Asia to everywhere. So tax administration gaps were one of the serious things that came out during the negotiations. No, so now let's look at the implication for Africa and then maybe limiting it to Ghana in a way. Now, revenue losses limit education investment. With all the issues outlined when it comes to taxation, if we have taxation rights, if we have a equal allocation of taxes, and if the rich and the poor are taxed equally, we realize that we will have a lot of investment into our education sector, especially public education that has been poorly financed and learning outcome being very low. It will also increase national budgets, as we know, and once the national budget increase, is going to affect all forms of social interventions. And then also it will strengthen public education system. So in Ghana, for instance, it will be difficult for you to see a rich person taking his child to a public school because the infrastructure to the teaching outcome, learning outcome, everything is so low. And then also it can reduce reliance on external funding. Now, it has affected us so much. Even CSO's countries, we always rely on external funding to almost finance all our social interventions, which is not very good and reliable or sustainable. So we have some education financing opportunities, looking at more predictable and sustainable funding, investing in inclusive education. Like I said, it has always been unfair. The marginalized people are rather not given enough resources. Meanwhile, if you want to look at equity, you realize that they also need an amount of money for planning and being taken care of because of their special needs. And then we're also looking at strengthening public education system and then reducing reliance. I think we've talked about that. Now let's quickly move to the role of national education coalitions. So with us, we came to join the tax justice in our country. And then also at the African level, we have to look at fair and progressive tax system. That is one of the key areas we have to advocate for. And then we also have to link tax justice to education outcomes. The comparison would help. We also have to engage policymakers and ministries and influence national and global policy spaces. We have to look out for those spaces and then create some influence there. And then we also have to look at campaign for increased education budgets and then promote transparency and accountability. Yes, we are paying the taxes. Where does it go? So this is when national coalitions has to follow and monitor and ask for transparency and accountability from stakeholders and policymakers. And then also creating a lot of awareness on tax justice. There is limited knowledge to the public when it comes to tax and then all the related issues that are surrounding it. And then we also have to collaborate with civil society networks. We really have to come together as civil society at your national level, at the African level, the global level. We have to really strengthen those networks to be able to influence the advocacy actions. Now we have to track public spending on education. We also have to ensure equitable allocation of the resources between the urban, the rural, and then where the equitable allocation is very key. Government commitments have to be monitored, especially political party manifestos and then all that. And then evidence for policy advocacy. So if we want to do our advocacy, we have to back it by evidence. We have to do some research. We have to get the figures and all that to be able to use for our advocacy. So we have some strategic opportunities. I'm almost getting to the end as our time is fast spent. We have to engage in UN and then the regional dialogues is very key. We have to look at the timing, participate, and then engage it. We have to strengthen our partnership, develop research and data, and build coalition capacity. So building capacity of national coalitions to be able to take advantage of the opportunities we have for our advocacy is very key. So, some key reflections. Tax justice is central to education equity. Global reforms must reflect developing country needs. Coalition must expand into fiscal advocacy, and sustainable education depends on domestic financing. In conclusion, UN Tax Convention is a historic opportunity. Education coalitions must act strategically. So in the UN Tax Convention, we have to be very strategic. I can recall that we were meeting in the night after every session to look at the gap and where we can advocate more. So we have to be very strategic, and fair taxation can transform education systems. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bernice, for sharing your reflection and experience, and also very important what national education coalitions can do. Yes, thank you for your clap to support the UN Tax Convention. And as Bernice said, this is very historic, and this could change the global tax architecture, and we should not miss this opportunity. The negotiations will happen until 2027, so there's time for us to advocate. And as Bernice mentioned, one of the observations that we had, Action Aid was there, GCE was there, the coalition of Senegal was there, and our colleagues from the fighting for public services were also there. One of our observations is that the developing country representatives are not there. My own country, the Philippines, was absent in Nairobi. The Pacific countries were all absent in the Nairobi. And so what happens is that the discussions tilt in favor of the developed countries like OECD. And therefore, there is time for us to advocate, remind our governments to participate effectively, actively in the UN Tax Convention, so that we will have a substantive UN Tax Convention in 2027. And from there, we can use this to advocate at our country level for parliamentary to put in place a legislature and change the tax rules in our countries accordingly. So colleagues, thank you to all the speakers, and we only have one session left, so please bear with us. But before I go into the summary, I would like us to answer the poll, and this is for you to share. Do you see the poll? Rene, do you see it? Okay, so colleagues, yes. Rene, I cannot hear you. Okay, thank you, Israel.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so please answer the poll. We have 6 questions. So this is the first question. What is the biggest barrier to financing quality education in your region? Yes. So if you can answer that. That's multiple choice, no? I don't see. Rene, can you see the multiple choice?
Yeah, you have to scroll down.
Okay, because I cannot see it from my screen. Okay, yeah. Okay, question number 2. Sorry, Rene, I have to ask you if you can see the question number 2. Which group is most left behind by current education financing gaps? Can you see it?
Yes, you have to scroll down again.
Okay. Are you able to respond to it? Sorry, I don't see it. Is it girls and women, children in conflict zones, learner with disability, children in poverty? But I only see a few responses. Is that correct? Okay. Colleagues, can you see the multiple choice, the choices?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if we go to question number 3, what reform should be the top priority at the financing for development? So, is it debt cancellation for low-income countries? Is it global minimum corporate tax, which is quite a debate as well? Increase ODA for education, or is it the reform of IMF World Bank conditionalities? Rene, are you able to respond on the
Yeah,
screen?
I have already responded and submitted.
Okay. Okay. And then question number 4, how effective is civil society advocacy in driving education financing commitments? Very effective, somewhat effective, neutral, limited impact, unsure. There's no one who answered. Okay. Only 4, 5. Okay. And then the 5th question is, what is the first action step you plan to take? One thing we can improve for future SDG financing sessions. Okay. And this is, I suppose, open-ended. Okay, colleagues. So thank you very much for those who have responded to the poll. And please continue responding to it while I give the summary. So we are now almost at the end of our webinar. And I'm going to reiterate the positions that we've had ever since. Now, just to say that there is an update that on April 15, the first ever borrowers platform was launched during the IMF World Bank spring meetings with the UN Trade and Development, or UNCTAD, serving as its secretariat. Is this the solution to what we're saying, debt crisis? And this will not be enough, because the platform, according to UNCTAD, it will bring together finance ministers, central bank governors from developing countries, but it's more on coordination, enhancement, capacity building, and also as a platform for discussions on debt management. So we have to look into this. It's called Borrowers Platform. This is where the borrowers of course, from developing countries will come together. And this is a follow-up to the Civil Compromiso de Civil. So let us look at this and see how this will put forward, or advance our advocacy. But at the same time, let's continue advocating for the convening of the UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt. So let me go back. Concrete actions must be taken to address the persisting problems that widen education financing gap. And all the speakers have already discussed, the need to address the global tax rules. And Ochizi and Bernice have already discussed how we can support the UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. As mentioned, it will go until 2027. We need to strengthen investment in social sectors, particularly essential public services. And colleagues, as you know, we are working with different movements and different civil society who are pushing for universal quality financing, universal quality public services for all. And in this is included education financing. So in the financing for development, we're not just talking about education financing. We're talking about public services, and we work with civil society who are working on financing public services. And this is how we got the text on linking the tax justice, the tax policies to SDG financing. So this is where we are working on in terms of the UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. And there is also a need to institute measures to ensure effective debt relief through transparent, participatory, and rights-based approaches to address the debt burden. And therefore, let us look at the Borrowers Forum, but at the same time, let's work towards convening the UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt. We also said that governments must secure increased allocation for SDG4 and the neglected SDG targets and promote transparent, inclusive, gender-responsive public sector budgeting. So not only in revenue sector, but also in expenditure side, we should also be very active in terms of budget allocation and also monitoring, as mentioned by our speakers, and as we are already advocating. And lastly, governments must critically examine innovative financing schemes. We have heard about paradigm shift in terms of financing skills. We have heard about financing models, but we must make sure that these innovative financing skills should serve and strengthen the public sector, uphold human rights, and attend to the needs of marginalized and vulnerable groups, and that governments must enforce regulatory frameworks and prevent privatization and corporate capture of education and other public services. So colleagues, thank you very much. Before we go, I would like to thank all the organizers. Apart from Global Campaign for Education, we have ASBE, ANSEFA, AKYA, we have CED Sri Lanka, we have the Burkina Faso Coalition, we have CLADE, we have GINEC, Tax Justice Network, Tax Ed Alliance. And so thank you very much to all the speakers. And I would also like to thank all the interpreters who have helped us. Vernor, thank you very much for being here. It's a pleasure to see you again and hear you present the Transforming Education Summit. So colleagues, thank you so much for participating and all the best in our advocacy. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Thea. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.